All right, what is up, everybody? Welcome back to another day of SaberSim's DFS Office Hours. It is Wednesday, November 10th, 2021. Thank you for tuning into the stream today. A 13-game NBA slate on tap tonight. I think our biggest NBA slate of the season so far. Almost every NBA team playing basketball tonight in the main slate. Should be a fun one. Hope you guys enjoyed the 3-game slate last night if you played. I took the night off. Don't ever sleep on the value of taking a slate off. Feel refreshed, ready to go, excited to jump into this slate here tonight. I know there are probably plenty of you that are like, yeah, I take slates off all the time. What is this guy talking about? But if you are a grinder like me, sometimes it can be kind of hard. You get a little FOMO, feeling like you're missing out on a slate. So definitely, especially on those smaller slates or a slate that you just don't really feel like playing, don't sleep on taking the slate off. Maybe I'm talking a little bit to myself. So because I definitely enjoyed that last night. But excited to get back into it here tonight. 13 games of NBA basketball on the slate. 3-game NHL slate if you've been playing hockey. If you haven't, or if you have, check out our strategy session. It's on our YouTube channel. Had Mr. Clean and Couch on last week talking a little hockey DFS strategy. Had a bunch of fun putting that one together. So I know the NHL channel in Slack has been buzzing a little bit more lately with questions and people bouncing ideas off each other and talking about how they want to approach the slate. So pretty awesome. Pretty cool stuff. But anyway, we'll go ahead and start getting into it here. We do have a handful of questions in the queue today. Actually, a pretty decent amount. Quite a few questions came in through Slack here overnight, last night, and into the morning today. So we'll answer everything. If you've got questions for me today, please go ahead and pop them into YouTube chat or in the Office Hours channel in Slack. I do my best to answer these in roughly chronological order here. So the sooner you get your question in, the sooner I will get to it. Real quick before we get started, Steven, not sure if you're here. Hope you are. I think I'm missing your question here. I see this chat came in. Might not be a very great question for Office Hours, but I'm pretty curious. I have that comment, but I don't see the question. So post your question back again. I might have missed it here. If you're watching me live, if you end up catching this as a recording, maybe shoot it back in as maybe a Slack in the Office Hours channel or an email support@sabersim.com. We'll get to it tomorrow. But anyway, let's go ahead, jump into it. Cool. So I'm going to start here. Let's go ahead. Let's get SaberSim up first of all. And start answering some questions. And I'm actually going to start here. And Swifty has a question, and I actually don't know the answer to this. So let's test it together here on stream today. He said, if I uncheck shooting guard for utility spot, will it not slot players who are multi, like the PG/SG, or just players that are only SG that won't be slotted in UTIL? I'm pretty sure it accounts for that multiplayer eligibility. So let's try to do exactly that and see what we get here real quick. So my expectation is that it will just not use any player that has shooting guard eligibility at all in that utility spot. But we'll find out here pretty quickly. It's a good question. I actually meant to just test this out before I hopped on stream and then forgot about it. So now we get to do it together and see. For what it's worth, I probably wouldn't mess with this too much in NBA, right? I think maybe hear a little bit of rules of thumb. Yeah, so anybody that has, here we can look at our entire pool. Anybody that has any shooting guard eligibility at all won't be used in the utility spot with that kind of rule we just put in there. So you can see there's, oh, shit. Oh, excuse me, pardon my language. So no, it looks like the opposite is true, actually. It is that only players with only shooting guard eligibility will not be used in that utility spot. So players like Zach LaVine and not very many players at all. So actually makes that a little less useful than I would have thought. I was going to say I wouldn't use this. I really probably wouldn't use this too much, and I wouldn't put too much stock into this for a sport like NBA, right? I don't really like to even use this in NFL. I think in general the Sims are going to do a good job of putting the right kind of players that have the right kind of upside into your utility spot, even if it is maybe a guy that mostly gets most of his points by just scoring, right? Those are kind of the players that people like to avoid here, is the guys that maybe just score a lot of buckets, higher variance kind of scoring types. I just don't think it's super valuable, right? The lineups, you're going to have lineups built in a way that is conducive towards maximizing upside anyway. You see a lot of these guys that score points in a lot of different kinds of ways. A lot of big men, right, that rack up those double doubles pretty easily, showing up in the utility spot. So isn't really too needed. But it does seem like that's the way it works. So it's only going to remove players that are specifically only eligible in that one way. So cool. Let's keep it going. Luke had a question, and it looks like JT provided some help here, but we'll go ahead and pull this up. And this is an NHL question, and he said, how can I force SaberSim to give me all 3-3 stacks in NHL? If I set a 3-man stack rule, it only gives me one 3-man stack. And JT responded, and he is right by saying you have to set 2 stacking rules. So if you want legitimately 3 threes, you have to set 2 different stacking rules. So I think the combination of stacking rules, a la Mr. Clean here, has become at least 3 players from the same even strength line. I know there's a lot of you guys that are using this kind of rule now. If you want to do this with 2 different rules, you can do at least 3 players from the same even strength line, and you will get at least 3 stacks in every single lineup. I know there was a follow-up here from Luke saying, that's great, but it is also now giving me 4-4 or 4-3 stacks, which I don't want. And JT responded again well and accurately here that you can remove those in step 3. This build is going a little slow here. I'm actually going to just cut it off. We don't need a ton of lineups here. Let's go ahead and just see what we're getting. So yes, you can go ahead and just obviously don't have a ton of lineups here, but you can just remove the 4-3 stacks here. Just keeping in mind that, a lot of times those 4-3 stacks that you're actually going to be getting there, those aren't the worst thing in the world, right? 4-3 stack. A lot of times you just end up with the defenseman like correlated into the stack, right? So like we've got, in this case, that's kind of weird. This guy's not on the same line as the line you have here. But the reason why that shows up, and it's just a 3-game slate tonight, so you're going to get a lot more 4-3 stacks just because the player pool is smaller. But a lot of times when you have that 4-3, it's because the defenseman that's getting thrown in there correlates to the rest of the stack the right way, right? So like, I guess this is a good example, right? Where, yeah, you have the defenseman that's gotten thrown in, but they all play on the same power play line. I know it's a second line, but again, only a 3-game slate tonight. So a little bit of an interesting situation here, but I would say that if you want to just completely remove them, obviously you can just zero out that stacking type here in step 3. The other thing you could do is set 1 additional stacking rule and say no more than 3 players on the same team. And that would be the easiest way to do it. So you would say 3 players from the same even strength line, 3 players from the same even strength line. So 2 3-3 stacks, but then don't give me more than 3 players on the same team in any lineup. And this combination of 3 rules will probably be the easiest way of accomplishing what you're trying to do there, Luke. So, but I would maybe be a little cautious with this last rule. I don't know how much value this actually adds, because those defensemen skating on the same line can be pretty correlated to the rest of the stack. So something to think about. But go ahead and clear that out and move on here. Neil's got another stacking question. And I see some, Marbrand, I see your question in YouTube chat here. We'll get to it shortly. I'm going to hit all these questions that came in before the start of the stream first. Neil said, in NFL, is there a way to force lineups to have a mini correlation or stack? I find I get a lot of lineups with one-offs, even during times when I adjust the correlation slider to the max. Yeah, let's talk about this. It's a good question. We built a tool for this season to allow you to do this exactly. So spoiler alert is yes, you can do this. But I want to talk first a little bit about just thinking through like why you may want to do this or why not. And why you may not be getting as many as you think you should be in your lineups by default, right? So you're building lineups, maybe you're playing the mini max, playing the weekly max challenge, correlation is high, right? Default settings, no stacking rules, you're going to find you're going to have that QB and wide receiver stack in the vast majority of your lineups. Not all of them, not your entire pool of 500 or 1,500, but the vast majority of them, right? Quarterbacks, very strong correlation. Actually, let's pick a quarterback that is not even a real rushing quarterback. Quarterback, very strong correlations to the receivers. Very strong, right? very strongly correlated to the opposing quarterback, and generally some decent sized correlations to the other receivers in the game playing on the other side, right? So that's why you get those game stacks. When we start looking at those other players, right? AJ Brown. Strongest correlation by far to the same team quarterback, then next is almost always the opposing team quarterback, right? Then we look at these correlations to other players playing on the other side of the ball. Under 0.1, right? Now, maybe you say, well, hey, Saints, like maybe not the powerhouse offense. What's a high total game? It's like, where's the chalk going to be this week? Maybe Cowboys, Falcons? Maybe Bucks football team? Oh, Vikings, Chargers. That's probably your chalk, right? Keenan Allen, right? Correlation of 0.11 to Adam Thielen. About how much correlated a QB is maybe to the other opposing wide receiver in general. But these aren't massive values, right? Keenan Allen, Justin Jefferson, 0.04. So these are going to show up in your lineups, right? This is a positive correlation. The correlation slider will pick it up. There will be kind of a multiplier added to the lineup. If we're building a lineup and Keenan Allen and Justin Herbert are in the lineup, all things else being equal, is more likely to include Thielen or Osborne or Jefferson than it is to include any other guy. But these aren't massive correlations, right? And that's something important to remember, is that these correlations are definitely there, but they are not huge. They're relatively small. And the reason why that matters is that, like, if a player in the individual sims you pull out when you're building your lineup has a big ceiling outcome game, right? That is very easily going to, if Mike Evans has a huge ceiling outcome game in your sims building that lineup and Justin Jefferson has an average game, right? It's going to use Mike Evans in the lineup even if Keenan Allen's already in there. That's why those things aren't going to show up all the time, especially with really high sim variance. The correlations aren't as big as people think, I think, and sim variance is very high. So those impact of what people actually score is going to overweight those little tiny correlations between those players. Now, Jordan, get off your soapbox. I get it. Show me how to do it because I want to do it. The easiest way to do it is with the advanced stacking tab. So the advanced stacking rules are going to let you control exactly what positions you want showing up in your stacks for any given team, whatever. They're going to show up in 100% of your lineups. So I think a very common combination I think that people do when you want to force those other stacks in would be to say something like, I want one QB, right? And then you say, you can use range here and say, this is, I think, the most common stack I see people set, is they'll say one QB with 1 to 3 pass catchers, right? A lot of times you have that run back here of one other player on the opposing team. And then if you want that other micro mini stack, you actually don't even need to include this in here. If you want the other micro mini stack, what you would do is basically just say, go in here and say, edit positions, and maybe say you want one running back, wide receiver, and tight end. And then I want that to correlate with a wide receiver and tight end on the opposing team, right? So one running back, wide receiver, and tight end from the primary team always has one wide receiver or tight end on the opposing team. I didn't do running back, wide receiver, tight end down here because I know that running backs are often negatively correlated to the running back on the other side of the ball, right? Yeah, Najee Harris's most negative correlation are the 2 running backs on Detroit. So you typically don't want to include those in there because you're going to run into some trouble. This is crazy too. I'm curious how people are going to project James Conner this week, if he is actually going to be projected like a top running back on the slate. That will be interesting. But you'll see also, like, James Conner, very negatively correlated to Christian McCaffrey. So that's how you would do that, is you would set this advanced stacking rule to create that kind of thing. And that's going to show up now in 100% of your lineups. A very important thing to note here, and I talked about this a little bit yesterday too as well, is even if you go in and set all these nice little stacking rules you have here, don't go then and turn your correlation slider down. Because the correlation slider is still, even now that you have the stacking rule, it's going to make sure that you use the best combinations of players, right? Like we want to know that if we have Devontae Adams in the lineup already, that it is better for that run back player to be DK Metcalf than it is for that run back player to be Will Dissly, right? He has a higher correlation. So if you turn that correlation slider down, you lose that value. So you want to keep that correlation slider up, even if you already have your stacking rules. But Neil said, thanks. Thank you for asking the question. And we'll go ahead and move us along. Okay, so Samuel had a question here. And he said, I was watching a video and I noticed when bumping projections on step 1, it goes by plus or minus 1. But on step 3, it goes by plus or minus 0.1. Is there a reason for that? And which is more substantial? Just want a clarification. Thanks. I find that odd. I think you're right. Right. It does these by 1 on step 1, and on step 3 here, it does 0.1. I noticed that as well. So I think it's supposed to just be 0.1 overall. I don't know why. I don't think it's supposed to be increments of 1 even on step 1. So I'll take that back to the team and see if that's something that we just need to tweak, because I don't think it's supposed to be 1.0 point value adjustments is kind of significant, and I don't think that's exactly what we intended. But either way, they should be the same on step 1 and step 3. So I'll figure out what the right value is there. In terms of which is more impactful, I mean, obviously, at the moment, increasing a projection by 1 is more impactful than increasing by 0.1, but I assume that's not what you're talking about. If you're talking more in general about where's just there a greater impact of adjusting projections, it's going to be on step 1. If you adjust projections on step 1, it's going to have a greater impact because it's going to extend all the way through your lineups, right? All of your 500 lineups in this case are going to be built with that projection update. Whereas what's happening here on step 3 is all we're doing is we are resorting the lineups that have already been built with the new projection, right? So we can't remake the lineups themselves. We can just resort with the new overall projection that's been inputted here. So your bigger impact for sure on your lineups is going to happen in step 1. It wouldn't be a significant impact, and I wouldn't like try to make use of that. I wouldn't be like, I wouldn't think about it from the standpoint of like, I want to bump Dearness Johnson down 2, but I don't want it to have a big impact, so I'm going to do it on step 3. Like I wouldn't get too into the weeds that way. I would in general encourage you, if you're going to make adjustments to projections, to do it in step 1. That is kind of the best place to do that. They will be persistent. First of all, they won't just be locked into that build. This adjustment I made to Dearness Johnson here is local to this build only. It won't follow us back here to step 1. And you will just get a nice pool of lineups that is more representative of what you want to do on the slate if you make your adjustments in step 1. But I'll figure out exactly why these are not consistent here. The increments are not consistent, and we'll make an adjustment there. So. Okay, cool. Cameron here had a question, and it looks like Wise Guy responded to him. He said, can you go into detail on how SaberSim uses uploaded projections? As I understand it, changing ownership just overrides the SaberSim ownership, right? Yes, that is correct. Is that the same for custom projections, or does SaberSim weight the projections with the uploaded projections to create a third set? So we don't do any averaging or anything like that of your projection with ours. I will say so that Wise Guy did respond with a link to our documentation, the FAQ article that answers this question. That FAQ article does have a video in it that will go into a little bit more detail than I can do here. But basically what happens is if you bump Josh Allen down, for example, to 25.04, you subtract, you remove 2 points from his mean projection. What we do is we go into the game simulations we have for every single game for the Bills game on the slate, and we lower Josh Allen's projection by that same difference, -2 points. And it basically has the impact of shifting this entire distribution, this entire range of outcomes to the left, to the negative by 2 points. So you still get the advantage of our game simulations. The game simulations still kind of help power everything, but we've adjusted every game sim based on the difference between our projection for the player and your projection for the player. So that is basically how that works. And again, for ownership, it is just like a direct override. So you think Josh Allen's going to be 15% owned, then we now treat it as if he's 15% owned. Blame the Flame has a question here. And he said, I already selected the guys I want in my pool. Should I modify the ownership fade slider in any way? It depends, I think. I think it kind of depends on, I would say probably not. I would probably not make any adjustments to the ownership fade slider, right? If you've picked your player pool in step 1 and you know the guys that you want to play, I think it still makes sense to take into account ownership in some capacity and like play play the best plays with some regard to ownership overall and how owned they are going to be. The exception there would be if you have taken significant stands with your player pool. Like, it kind of depends on how you've curated your player pool, right? If you say that you've curated your player pool by maybe I've removed every player that's projected under 21. I want baseline people to have a 21-point projection. I would definitely leave ownership fade on, because the players that you've removed from your pool are going to be a lot of low-scoring guys that probably aren't going to be very highly owned. But if you told me, let's go back and put this back to the default 15. If you told me that you had taken very intentional stands and you had like unchecked the chalkiest player on the slate or a couple of the really chalky plays and like have decided that you're going to fade them, that might be enough leverage on the field from the standpoint of ownership. And at that point, I think you could justify turning the ownership fade slider down or off if you've taken a big ownership stand. So, but I would say without knowing exactly what your player pool looks like and knowing what you're actually doing to it, I would say by default, probably just leave it on is probably the safest bet. So. Baron has a really interesting question here. And I have two more questions that came in Slack before the stream. So we'll get to these two, and then we'll start knocking out some of these questions that came in live. But Baron said, if a big part of your NBA process is ownership leverage adjustments in step 3, on a large main slate such as tonight, do you recommend only dialing in the exposures on the games that lock at 7 p.m. Eastern, and then dealing with the exposure settings in step 3 with each player pool prior to each subsequent lock with the late swap tool? Or in that scenario, does it make sense to put the ownership fades we want in step 1 of the late swap build to help the builder create the most optimal late swap lineups based on our desired ownership numbers? This is a great question. I think this really gets at what I think is kind of challenging about NBA DFS, and I actually think where a lot of the edge is. To be honest, I actually don't make a lot of adjustments to exposure in NBA DFS, actually for this particular reason, because not only are you could spend all this time before lock doing your research and determining where you think the best fades on the slate are. And it could change right before lock, right? Even in the 5 o'clock or the 7 o'clock Eastern games, right? Something could change and you have to update that all at the last second. But then almost certainly at each individual lock window, you're going to have some kind of news, some sims are going to run, maybe a starting lineup is a little bit different, that changes things. And the more impactful that news, the more significantly it changes. And not only do you need to go in and update, right? Like you need to actually rerun that late swap. You theoretically need to adjust your strategy. And there's so many variables going on, right? Like if Giannis, I always use Giannis as an example. He's like the first guy that pops in my head. But if Giannis gets ruled out 15 minutes after lock before this game, it changes the whole context of the slate. And your ownership and your exposures and the way you would have approached your leverage spots have changed dramatically. So to be completely honest, when I'm playing NBA, I will typically more have the stance of I am going to get a big enough edge here, leveraging the ownership that I know at the start of the slate, using a strong set of projections, leveraging our simulations, building great lineups, playing great contests, and then late swapping when that news breaks. And I don't really even set too many exposures here for NBA, right? Because something can change. It can just blow it all up. And the edge, you get such a huge edge just by late swapping it all, right? On a 13-game slate, there is almost certainly, it is virtually a guarantee, even if it's not a star player getting ruled out, that something is going to happen after lock. We are going to get some news about some player that is a surprise that creates significant value on some other players on the same team, that those players are going to be well under-owned for their new value, and you're going to have a ton of edge there that you don't really even need to like worry about getting a ton of leverage on the right plays, I think, at lock. And the bigger the slate, the more the case that is. On a slate like yesterday, 5-game slate, again, I didn't play yesterday, or 3-game slate, I didn't play yesterday, but on that particular slate, there can be news that breaks after, but the chance of it happening is a little bit lower. And I think you can justify spending a little bit more time dialing in your exposures and trying to find some leverage on a slate like yesterday's. But tonight, I probably really won't even mess with it at all. Because I can come in here and mastermind my exposures and decide that like my fade is I'm going to be well under the field on Jeff Green, right? Because maybe, especially if Jokic, is Jokic suspended? I don't know if Jokic is suspended, but He's already good value. He's been starting in place of Michael Porter Jr. and Jokic is going to be maybe out. Jeff Green's going to be like a really popular play, but low salary guy, low usage guy, I'm fading him, right? But then again, some news comes out here, and I don't even know if this is a great example, but some news comes out here, and I maybe Luka's out or something like that. Just pick somebody. And there's all this value that's opened up on Dallas, right? Under-owned Dallas value. Like, you can pivot very easily there. That I don't even care now if I'm rostering 30% owned Jeff Green because I'm getting like 4% owned Jalen Brunson. Doesn't matter. I think you can actually prevent yourself from late swapping optimally by holding too tightly to the exposure settings you set at lock on NBA, right? I would at the very least say that if you are going to go through and set your exposures and really spend a lot of time pre-lock for NBA, figuring out where you are going to get your leverage, you have got to figure out a process that is going to take place in between the individual lock windows that allows you to like check that in between locks. And maybe that's, if I don't know what you might be doing. Maybe you're running research builds like we've talked about here before to figuring out how you want to find leverage, right? The articles and maybe the content and the podcasts and the videos you might be listening to throughout the day aren't going to update for you in between each lock window. So those you're probably going to have to throw out the window. But if you are going to have a very exposure editing focused process where you're finding leverage like that, you also need to make sure that process is repeatable quickly in between individual lock windows so you can update your positions quickly. Right? I mean, a really good example is like if your fades are a star, right? So like tonight, it looks like we're going to be kind of spread out. Giannis got way priced up, but like let's say Curry is like a lot chalkier than the rest of these guys, right? And that's your stand, right? You're going to be under or completely fade Curry. If news comes out, especially if another star gets ruled out here, like let's say Giannis gets ruled out or Luka gets ruled out, it does a few things. It takes away other places to spend your money, right? Spend your salary. It makes Curry a better overall play at his price point because there are just less plays at that price point. And also the value that opens up on the other teams makes it easier to get Curry in the lineup. So even if you had done some kind of approach that led you to believe, I'm thinking really like a research build. If you had done a research build and you had determined that Curry was a good fade at 7 p.m. Eastern, he might not be at 9 p.m. Eastern, right? So you need to be able to make sure that you can update your priors quickly with your process. And I frankly don't think it's very easy to do that without like sitting at the computer and staying dialed in the entire night. I also don't think it adds a ton of value compared to the value you get just by late swapping at all. So I don't really do it. But for baseball, football even, absolutely, right? I've walked through my processes for football and baseball on our channel in other videos, and I do those research builds and things like that because I know the slate is unlikely to get completely flipped over multiple times throughout the night or throughout the day in the case of football, right? It can. There are certain slates where you know that there's maybe an inactive in the afternoon games that could change the context of the slate a bit, but it's not as much as it happens in NBA. So, but really good question there. And definitely, I think like a very uniquely NBA thing of you have to make sure that your process, whatever you're doing, is very time efficient, something that you can do quickly and repeat quickly, and also very like adaptive and flexible, that you haven't locked yourself into a certain stance on a slate that doesn't allow you to respond when the slate changes. I think overall you are thinking about the thing the right way here. And this is the last thing I'll say on this before I move on. But one of the ways that I always like to think about my lineups for NBA specifically as a way to just kind of remove lock bias is the lineups that I'm playing at 7 p.m. Eastern are actually just the players playing in the 7 p.m. Eastern games, right? The rest of the lineup is just placeholders. If nobody in the lineup is playing in these first two games, then the lineup hasn't even nothing's locked in. Everything's wide open still. and it will help you avoid getting too locked into those lineups early. But anyway, I'll move on from there. Let me know if anybody has any kind of follow-up questions there on it, because I think it's a good question. But we'll hit this question from KJ real quick here. And let's see. About the entry editor, he said, when using unique fill across multiple single entry and 20 max contests, is fill entry order randomized, or will the highest saber score lineup go into the first contest I entered? I'm wondering, since I entered the $4 20 max last when selecting contests in DK, if those lineups will be my lowest saber score when filling in SaberSim. So it's a legit random fill. So if you uniquely fill your lineups into a bunch of different contests in the entry editor, they will legitimately fill randomly at the moment. I know. I'll say a few things. I've answered this question a bunch. We are planning on adding something in the future that allows you to control more getting your highest saber score lineups into your highest dollar contests. That's something we want to do. I think the variance overall in those saber scores between your first and your 50th lineup, right, are not very high overall, or the variance is actually very high. And like, I wouldn't actually sweat it that much. Like, let's look at this. So if we're talking about building 50 lineups, maybe you're playing 2 20 maxes and a couple 3 maxes and single entries and things like that, right? Your 100 saber score lineup and your 94.8 saber score lineup, right? There's a difference there. Theoretically, that first lineup is going to be higher expected value over the long term, but in an individual contest, I don't think it's such a difference in EV that like it really makes a huge difference. But we do want to give you guys more ability to make sure that the highest saber scoring lineups are showing up in those highest dollar contests using unique fill if you want them to. It sucks when your best performing lineup is in your lowest dollar contest on the night. That can happen here, but the opposite can be true too, right? Like your 49th lineup could be your highest scoring lineup on the slate very easily. And you can get lucky in both ways. You can get lucky or you can get unlucky with the random fill right now. So yeah, but good question there. Marbrand asks a very interesting question here. And I think now following up the question I was just kind of rambling about here, maybe you guys will probably see where I'm going with this, but he said, when you finish your build, what sort of players do you recommend lowering your leverage and raising your leverage if you're under leveraged? This is for 20 max, 10 to 50K entries. And he said that was for NBA. So yes, again, I will first say here that on NBA, I am really much less likely to make these kinds of adjustments here, especially the bigger the slate, because of the fact that I know things are going to change, right? Like I'm really kind of counting on getting a lot of my edge by using great projections to begin with, leveraging SaberSim sim data, but especially late swapping, right? Like I have a video on our channel that says late swap is the biggest edge in NBA, and I really believe that that is true. But if you wanted to kind of dial into the exposures here and find some edge here, find some leverage by making adjustments, one of the things I like to look at here is I like to look at players that are trying to think about the right way to say this. There are often players in NBA in particular that are finding their way into chalk because they fit rather than because they project really well as great plays, right? So I like to add the value column in here, and I'll sort just by point per dollar value. Point per dollar value is not the end all be all here with any DFS sport, but it's pretty good for NBA. And for example, plays that I am generally just okay with, like I'm totally fine with getting here, are the plays that are projecting really well, right? Like people may key into the Cade Cunningham ownership, highest projected owned player on the slate, but if he's going to project for 7 average projected points per dollar, I have no problem playing him, right? I like to look and see if I can start to spotlight players that are maybe chalkier or are going to be chalky, that don't have that high point per dollar range, that typically fit into lineups because of where the chalk is and where the chalk has opened up, right? On DraftKings, where there's a ton of multi-positional eligibility and it's a 13-game slate, you're going to see this a little bit less. On FanDuel, you'll see this a little bit more. The smaller the slate, you'll see this a little bit more. But guys like Julius Randle and Jason Tatum are two guys that are popping here right off the bat to me as top 10 chalky players that don't actually project all that well based on SaberSim, which makes me think that either there's other models are going to project those players well, and maybe they're going to be chalky, or they're just fitting, right? These guys actually have very similar positional eligibility too, which makes me think that there's probably a lot of guard value, right? Which there's just a lot of value on the slate tonight. It's a big slate, but if there's a lot of, like, if the chalkiest value plays on the slate are at the guard positions, it can create lineups where players that aren't projecting that well are ending up being much chalkier than others. So these are kind of the plays that I like to look at as possible fades. These are the plays that I'd like to be underweight on, are the plays that are getting chalky for a reason that doesn't really have to do with their raw projection or potential. So maybe that looks like in the case, and some of these we're just already underweight on. Like we're underweight on Tatum, but maybe we take like a much harsher stand with Tatum. We're about even with the field on Randall. Maybe we are directly under the field on him, right? Those are the kind of plays that I like to look for. Is who's chalky and shouldn't be. Who doesn't project all that well for how chalky they are. Maybe you get some box score watchers with Curry, and this is a play that we're actually overweight on at the moment. So maybe we come in under the field here too, right? That's what I would look for. But again, this process needs to be something that you can adjust to when the slate changes completely 30 minutes after lock. Because again, you know, news can change directly in those players' games, right? There's things that could happen in the Warriors and Minnesota game that means Curry projects better before his game started than he did before lock. But things can happen to the slate overall where a player gets ruled out or new value opens up that makes a play a better overall play because of how he fits into the lineups after the slate locks as well. So, yeah, that's what I would focus on overall for NBA. But good question there as well. Let's keep it rolling. Aaron, follow up with the running back correlation thing I was talking about earlier. Same running back correlation in a game is negative, but what if the players on either team are both of vocal points on their teams? How do you choose the better play? Would you just use the better player? Well, honestly, that is, I think, partly the value of our game simulations, right? We don't really have to solve that problem for every single game on the slate and every single running back because we are simulating out these games play by play thousands of times, right? And then pulling from those sims directly when we build each individual lineup, we can kind of identify what the spots are where you have two talented running backs on a team. What are the game scripts where both of those guys can be successful, right? Like I used the example of Najee Harris and DeAndre Swift, who, yes, are negatively correlated, right? But are also both talented and surely have game scripts where both players succeed. There are actually probably even lineups, if you built 1,500 lineups, that are going to have both players, because even though they are negatively correlated, both players are talented and they're going to have those game scripts, right? So we don't have to answer that question necessarily for ourselves. And I wouldn't. Like, same deal here. I don't know if Cook's going to play this week with all his controversy going on, but Cook and Eckler, right? Two talented running backs, opposite sides of the ball. When does it make sense to play them together? Well, the sims will help us answer that question. So, or between choosing which one's the right play, right? Like same deal, the opposite is true as well, right? Like maybe the negative correlation is too high and we're not ever going to play those two players together. Well, which one is the better play? The simulations will help us make that determination based on who actually has the higher upside and who correlates better to the other pieces of the lineup and who's lower owned, right? There's a lot of factors at play here. So I think that's really the value. Like, this is just one of the many possible questions that you would be forced to kind of deal with and grapple with and ultimately set up some rules to account for if you were using a traditional tool. But these questions for us here are kind of we're already helped along in answering these questions here by leveraging the tools that SaberSim has. So Aaron said, thanks, man, like Chubb Mixon last week. Yeah, it can absolutely happen, right? There's plenty of game sims where both of those guys are successful. The correlations are just an average. So. Cool. Okay, let's keep it going. See some other questions here. So Marbrand said, due to the edge in late swap, especially on a large slate, is there merit to limiting your exposure to early games to be better prepared to take advantage of late swap value in NBA? Man, this is another hard question. I think there can be. There definitely can be. Especially if I think where it would probably be most useful is if you know that there are big questionable players playing in the late games, right? Like, I don't know what Brandon Ingram's actual status is here for tonight's game. If he's legitimately questionable, right? Like, that's a guy that would count there. Malcolm Brogdon would count as that too, right? Those are two definitely decent players that could be ruled out that would create a lot of value. It's the slates that like where you've got like Giannis or Curry or somebody, and they are legitimately questionable, like very questionable. Maybe the team says they are just like a legit game time decision, that I think it can really make sense to do that. The problem is, though, is you don't want to necessarily sacrifice raw point output in your lineups to get there, right? So does it potentially make sense to limit your exposure to maybe some stud players playing in these first games that don't project all that well and would take up a lot of salary, right? Like maybe limiting your Kevin Durant exposure, who projects like pretty average, costs 10-9, right? Same deal with Harden, right? Beal even. Yeah, like it might potentially. But would you want to go ahead and start limiting your exposure to Rubio or Suggs or these value plays that project well and get you the opportunity to use your salary more efficiently just on the chance that you have to late swap? I don't know. Or like Cade Cunningham is in the very next game, who's our best overall value play on the slate at the moment, right? Like, would you want to limit your exposure there to give yourself more flexibility for later games? I don't know. Probably not. So I would say in general, the bigger name player, the higher overall projected player that has a legitimate questionable designation, the more likely I would be to do that, right? Ingram and Brogdon are interesting, but they're not exactly those kinds of guys. So I'm not super tied into that. And I also would be careful limiting your exposure to players that project well in those early games, because you might lose the ability to build, the best lineups possible. Like, put another way. Let me put this another way. If you are making a stand here and, did this just update? I feel like, that's his ownership. That's not his value, right? Where's the value, right? If you're trying to create some late swap flexibility and you're fading some of these great projected plays in the early games, you should look at how much raw point projection you are giving up and then ask how likely it is that you're going to be able to make that up later. So you could actually do this if you wanted. Like if you really wanted to like get kind of analytical about this, what you could do is like, let's take a 20 max build and let's do this here. So let's put the shooting guards back in utility and let's just see what our top 20 lineups kind of look like, right? We'll get a sense of about how many projected points we're getting for these. This is kind of like how I would think through this question if I was kind of doing it myself here. Okay. So let's make 2 adjustments here quickly. So you can see, like, right, we're getting a ton of Rubio. He projects really well. This also, going back to my other question before, right, starting to think about, well, I actually think it was your question, Marbrand, starting to think about like why are guys like Julius Randle and Jason Tatum, even though they don't project that well, getting a lot of ownership? You can kind of see it's because the builder is very easily using value guards. So it's making stud forwards pop a little more. But anyway, right? So we can build lineups that are projected for about 290, 280, 290-ish, right? Like that's where these lineups are. Yeah. So now let's go back and see if we wanted to optimize for late swap flexibility and what happens if we just exclude these games. Now let's do another build and see. And what we'll basically see is how much projection do we have to give up to give ourselves additional late swap flexibility. And I don't know what the answer to this question is going to be. I will see what happens here. I'm interested to see. Okay. So our first two lineups here, and again, we haven't sorted by projected scores, so this isn't perfect, but our first two lineups are still projected around 289, but you see some of these next lineups that start to come up, 284, 286, 284, 287, 287, 285, right? Like maybe on average, we're giving up 5-ish points of raw projection here to do this. Even maybe a little bit more once we get to the 20th lineup. We're giving up like 10 points of projection here. So then we have to ask ourselves, is the chance of late swap news opening up? So just to even break even then, right? We need late swap news to open up that allows us to create 10 additional points of projection in the later games. If a guy like Brandon Ingram or Brogdon got ruled out, we might get there. If some other random news, right? There's totally random news that could break in a 13-game slate that we have no idea that's coming. We could get there. But 10 points is quite a bit to think about. We're gonna make that up, right? That's quite a bit. We're basically counting. I would say we are counting on at least one piece of big significant news to just break even there on that trade, and probably need like two things to happen, two multiple big kind of breaking news things to get there. So again, if I had a player at the top here if Curry was like a legit game time decision, truly questionable, Giannis, somebody like that, I might think about doing that. But in the state of this particular slate, I don't know if I would. 10 points is a lot. But that's how I would think through that. And I think the idea has merit overall, for sure. There are going to be slates this year where we have that situation, where we have that guy that is playing in maybe right in the middle of the slate, a legitimate game time decision, and will open up tremendous value on the team if he were ruled out, that I think you can justify doing those things. But another option, and the last thing I'll say before I move on, would be to take a lighter approach to this. And rather than saying I'm going to go in and eliminate all of the players playing in these games, is I'm going to eliminate, like the players I was saying earlier, is I'm going to get rid of the high salary players that don't project all that well. Maybe even you leave Durant in there, right? But I'm going to just make sure if I'm going to play somebody in this game, I don't want just by sheer luck that my salary ends up tied up on a player that doesn't project well. So I'm going to eliminate a few players that maybe just don't have a very high point per dollar target in these games, and just make sure that I'm a little bit more optimized. I think that's a cool idea. And I know I've been very keyed into the value column here and the point per dollar and average projections for NBA, which definitely runs a little bit counter to what we talk about for a lot of our other sports. But truthfully, I think average projection and value and things like that are very valuable tools in NBA, where the player's average projection is pretty predictive. So the Nancy Drew guy says, how many players in step 3 do you change exposure for? I'm afraid I'm changing too many. For NBA, again, not very many, like sometimes none. Again, slate, the news breaks late and often in NBA, and it is very impactful. I think the bigger edge you get is late swapping and making your late swaps as flexible as possible. So I don't a lot of times make a lot of adjustments in NBA. For NFL, a lot of times, one of the things I mentioned here in my NFL video where I walked through my full process is I will key in on maybe somewhere between, depending on the slate, 2 to 8 players that I think really the slate kind of very heavily revolves around. 2 to 8 or so, probably on the lower side of that, maybe 2 to 6 kind of players that I think really are like the big pivot plays on the slate. You don't have to find your leverage on every single player on the slate by any means, right? Let's see how things are looking. We have time. We have time today. Let's run a research build and let's see. Let's run this. So again, if you haven't seen me do this before, what we're doing is we're basically simulating the slate 1,500 times. We're saying, show me the optimal lineup of just who the highest scoring owned lineup is. I don't know why I said owned. Show me what the highest scoring lineup is, 1,500 different slate simulations. And I like to compare this against ownership projections and start getting an idea of where I think the leverage is going to be. So we'll see what this looks like. And a lot of times, again, I'll pick like two to eight players out of this that I think there's an opportunity to fade or get additional exposure to. So Samuel said, hey, Jordan, well, no idea if you were able to answer my question. I did. Tackled that at the start of the stream. So I would say check out the recording there. And let me know if you have any follow-up questions. I'll have a time-stamped version of this video up too on YouTube after I hop off, so you can go find the exact timestamp of where I answered it. Jeffrey said, who's your little owned tournament breaking golfer this week? I didn't play golf this week. The contests have been pretty small. I know fall golf is like not as popular as a time for golf DFS. I haven't been playing as much recently, but I've been keeping an eye on the contest. As soon as this contest size comes back a little bit, I'll probably start diving in a little bit more, but that might end up being closer to the start of the year. I think is when things start to come back on the swing. So, but I mean, generically speaking, a lot of times what I like to look for, since I have time while we're doing this build, is somebody. I like to go find the high salary golfers that people aren't playing for some reason that I think is silly. You know, recent form or course history or things that where the sample size is really low, but I think it's impacting ownership. A lot of times is my guy that I like to go for. I don't like going and getting those like min priced 6-7K guy that nobody's playing. That's not my strategy, but I don't even know who's in the field this week, but there's always some guy that's 10K, 9K that nobody ends up playing. And I'm just not a big recent form guy. I'm not a big course history guy. And I think a lot of times those are the plays. It depends on the course too. Some courses, course history is more predictive than others. But there's probably, without knowing who's in the field at all, without having looked at a projection or an ownership projection this entire week, I guarantee you there's some 9K to 10K golfer that nobody's playing this week or is going to be 10% or less owned for no good reason. James said it, Cameron Smith or Kupka. Could be. I don't know. Again, I haven't checked. But yeah, probably one of those guys. But anyway, let's jump back here. Whose question am I answering? This one. Okay, so let's look at this now, right? So I think there's probably a discrepancy here between ownership projections and exposure at this point, and projection at this point in the week, right? Like Dearness Johnson, if he is the starter and Chubb's out, he's not going to be 7% owned. But we can go ahead and start to look at this. Same deal with Connor, right? Like if Connor is going to project this well around the industry, he's not going to be this lowly owned. But let's see if we can start to identify our fades. Well, maybe this one, right? Like this actually is screaming to me, just like yelling that the Chargers fade is maybe a good approach, right? We're seeing that these guys are showing up. They're going to be roughly 10 to 15% more owned than their chance of showing up in the optimal lineup, right? That seems like a good start. Mike Williams pops up here a little bit too, right? We also see a lot of Minnesota guys. So a little bit less, but like even the run backs of these particular plays don't look spectacular, right? And you can see as we come down this list and these negative leverages are going down, right? Like that is speaking to me now all of a sudden that like that might be enough of the stand I need on this slate. Like if I'm going to come in underweight on Chargers Vikings game stacks and come in underweight on almost every player playing in that game, that might be enough for me if the slate was starting right now. I don't need an edge on every single player on the slate. Again, a lot of times I'll look at the positive leverage too, but I think these ownership projections are probably just off. But as a starting point, right? Let's go ahead and pull up opponents here too. Like that, as I'm starting to think about the slate, that's kind of the way that I'm thinking about this here. So it's maybe my stand, maybe my value add, my stance, my leverage play is fading that Chargers Vikings game. That's chalky, overowned. Maybe I'm playing some Josh Allen stacks, right? Looks pretty nice. 15% chance to be optimal, 7% owned. And go from there. So it doesn't need to be. I definitely think there's a misconception that you need to have a perfectly optimized stand on every single player on the slate, and I don't think you need to. Pick your spots. So 2 to 6, 2 to 8 is what I typically do. And in that particular case, it was more of a stack or a game, right? Like because of the way that particular research build broke out, it was more that I'm more interested in fading this game than it was on specific players. Some weeks it's specific players. On the video I actually put up, it just so happened that it was like Darrell Henderson and Chris Godwin were like my two guys that I thought were really overowned. In this case, it was like a game, but just a few. So, cool. I think we got through pretty much everything here. I don't see any other questions. Got through pretty much everything today. So we'll go ahead and leave it there. We're right at about an hour here. Thanks again for everybody that tuned in, asked questions, participated, added your comments, your thoughts. Thank you to everybody that watches this show maybe after work, while you're building your lineups here for the NBA slate, whatever you do. Appreciate all you guys. We will be right back here again tomorrow at 2 p.m. Eastern. So if you have questions as you're building your lineups tonight, email us, support@sabersim.com, or pop them into the Office Hours channel in Slack. Good luck on this massive 13-game NBA slate tonight. Should be fun. Good luck if you're playing the little 3-game hockey slate as well. Football right around the corner here again tomorrow. In the meantime, take care. See ya.